I think there are still a couple of people coming in, but we don't want to spend too much more time, so we'll get started. Thank you for being here tonight. My name is Chanel Dixon. I'm a former state representative from District 24 and Executive Director of Idaho Solutions. Tonight's event is hosted by Save Our Schools. It was founded by retired veteran public school champions. Save Our Schools Idaho is dedicated to providing information, data, and education to the people of Idaho about vouchers and other efforts to divert public tax dollars to private school tuition. So tonight we hope to be able to answer your questions. We'll have the bulk of the time for questions about the recently passed private school tuition voucher that Governor Little signed into law this last legislative session. We'll give an overview of the impacts of that legislation. I'll introduce our panelists. We'll take questions from the audience, and as you probably noticed, tonight we are doing that via index cards. So if you don't have an index card and you have a question, you can kind of raise your hand and somebody will bring you a card. And then after you've written your question, just raise your hand with your card and somebody will collect it and bring it up to me, and we'll try to get through all of those tonight. I do just want to remind you that in Idaho we are respectful, and so tonight we want to have a respectful conversation, and I would ask that you're respectful of our panelists and of one another. Please no shouting out or yelling. I'm sure we're all excited to learn about House Bill 93, but we want to have positive experience tonight. And if, as I look through the questions, if we have multiples of basically the same question, I'll just ask it once. So if it's rephrased a little differently than what's on your card, that's why. So just know that we're working, we'll try to get through all of them. We do have a couple of lawmakers in the audience tonight.
Did you see Meg come in just a minute?
If you're a lawmaker, would you mind standing up and just giving us a little wave? We appreciate you being here. So this evening, after the event, I would invite you to chat with them for a few minutes if you have questions specifically for them. Just to get into, as we start, the mechanics of House Bill 93. It was in March, Idaho lawmakers passed House Bill 93. It created a $50 million voucher program offering private school students up to $5,000 each or $7,500 for special needs students for tuition to private and religious schools, homeschools, and other educational expenses. For the first time in Idaho's history, public dollars will now go to private school tuition. House Bill 93 is a tax credit voucher, which means that recipients claim the credit on their taxes, and there's no cap per household, so families can receive more than what they pay as well in taxes that year. For example, a family with 4 children could receive $20,000 back each year, even if what they paid in Idaho income taxes was lower than that. So this voucher program will be instituted or administered through the Idaho Tax Commission. And just so you're aware, they don't administer any other education program. They're not in the education business, but the Tax Commission will be responsible to develop the forms, administer the program, and theoretically, recipients are required to show proof of the expenses that are used for their tax credit if they're audited. And so they're told to keep receipts and so forth. Right now, only 2% of Idaho tax returns are audited. In other states, similar tax credits have been used to pay for Lego sets, trips to Disneyland and Disney World. I just read an article from Florida talking about that. TVs and many other non-educational related expenses without any repercussions because of the lack of accountability built into the tax credit structure. And we'll talk more about that as far as our bill here in Idaho. During public hearings, testimony on House Bill 93 opposed the bill by a factor of 20 to 1. And the emails and phone calls to legislators were easily 20 to 1 as well. 73 superintendents signed a letter in opposition. That is over half of the school districts in Idaho. And during the week before the governor's decision, a record-breaking 37,000 Idahoans called the governor's office, and a vast majority, actually 86% of those 37,000 people asked for him to veto the bill. Proponents of House Bill 93 have already begun work to expand the bill to over $300 million per year, which would have significant impacts on Idaho's budget and taxes, as you might imagine. So tonight we want to talk about, I've had some comments from people, well, why are you having this town hall when the bill has already been passed? But we want people to understand what is in the bill and then what we can do. There are some things that we'll talk about tonight that you can do. And we have three great panelists tonight who are going to talk to us about how this will affect our community, how we can navigate this, and how we can use our voices effectively. So I will introduce our three panelists and then give them each 3 minutes to kind of give an intro of their thoughts, and then we'll go from there. So we'll start with Christopher Alm at the end, and he has been a teacher in the Magic Valley for 14 years, teaching grades 6 through 12, teaching subjects ranging from mathematics to honors government, and currently serving as the high school librarian at Kimberly High School. He holds a bachelor's degree in secondary education from Boise State and a master's degree in theology from Concordia Irvine. He is a native of Buell, Idaho, and an advocate for public education and local decision-making, representation of local community issues at the state level, and support for traditional Idaho values. So thank you, Chris, for being here. You can give him a round of applause. Next, we have Luke Schroeder. He brings 31 years of experience in public and private education, including 27 years in school and district level administration. He is completing his 13th year as a superintendent of Kimberly School District here in Idaho, and his administrative background also includes 5 years as a secondary principal, 6 years as a private school elementary principal, and 3 years as a secondary vice principal. Luke has contributed his expertise to several statewide initiatives, including serving on Governor Brad Little's Education Task Force and K-12 Education Council. His work reflects a commitment to collaborative leadership, thoughtful policy development, and maintaining public education as a vital cornerstone of democracy and opportunity. Thanks for being here, Luke. And last, but certainly not least, we have Blanca Romero, who was born in Mexico and grew up in Twin Falls, along with her 2 siblings. She graduated from Twin Falls High School. Blanca moved to Haley in 2014 with her 2 daughters, who are currently enrolled in the Blaine County School District. Since 2018, she has worked at the Hunger Coalition as a programs and volunteer manager. Blanca developed an interest in advocacy after seeing the effects of food insecurity across her county. Blanca enjoys spending time with her family and pets in her off time, as well as enjoying the natural beauty of the valley in the summertime. Ms. Romero was elected to the school board in 2020. Welcome to Blanca. All right, so with that, we will start with our 3 minutes each. So Blanca, how about we start with you, and we'll just go down the road.
Hello, thank you all so much for being here tonight. We are gathered here tonight to champion for public education. When Horace Mann, the father of the American public school, advocated for universal education, he believed that public education was essential for a strong democracy and was needed for a more just society. This is why we're here tonight. To continue standing up for public education, its funding, and the students who attend public schools. We want every single child in Idaho to have access to an education that will help them succeed as adults in our society. Idaho is already the state that funds public education the least. We are 50 out of 50 states. And by implementing school vouchers, the state legislature is telling us that public education does not need to be well funded. They expect a world-class education with substandard funding, which of course will not happen. We must put pressure on our legislators to not let the vouchers program's $15 million cap expand, and we see what has happened in other states. So I plead with you today to reach out to your local legislators to see how they voted and to let them know how you feel about that. And this is a very important issue, so we need to all make sure that we stay engaged. Thank you.
I was going to say that was really, really well said. I do not have quotes. I am not quite that refined or sophisticated. I'm excited to be able to come up and speak tonight because it is nice to go through and have these dialogues, to go through and look at the legislation that is passed with good intentions, but sometimes unforeseen ramifications. So as a government teacher, one of my favorite things to do is talk about transparency and accountability. So I think it's always important to go through and have these events, and it is a blessing in our area here in the Magic Valley that you guys have come out. So the biggest thing that I want to go through and say right off the bat is thank you for participating in your government, for going through and taking the time to go through and say, I want to be here to learn about this stuff. And it's Idahoans like you guys that make this whole thing work, make us go through and engage in democracy and to go through and understand these things. And you are an important part of showing our students civics in our country. It's great to see you here. So I honestly think that at the end, we need to give you guys a round of applause, because if you weren't here engaging, the conversations wouldn't happen. So my big thing is thank you for coming, and hopefully we can toss out some good info.
So just a moment ago, before this started, Chris and I were visiting about how far along we are in our careers, and he was happy to inform me when I started teaching, he was 9. So I'm at the age, if I have my glasses on, I can't see you. If I take my glasses off, I can't see my notes. First and foremost, it's very clear where I work and where I serve, but I want to be very clear that these are my views this evening and only my views, and I will be exercising my First Amendment rights and providing my opinions based upon my experience, and by no means am I speaking for or representing the Kimberly School District this evening. As I thought about tonight, two people that have, quotes from two people I'd like to share. One is Bono, and the other one is Kathleen Ney. For those who don't know Bono, he's the lead singer for U2. And Kathleen Ney was superintendent prior to me, and she was also is the spouse of Senator Laird Ney that served in the Idaho Senate from 1980 to 2004. And Kathleen Ney used to be very involved in the Republican Party, that now her and Laird are enjoying retirement. But the quote from Bono, if you haven't heard it, many times he speaks about America. And he says, America is not a place, it is an idea. And Kathleen Ney used to often tell me, and she would get fired up when she would say this, she'd say, Luke, we have to maintain public education. This is a matter of national security. We have to have public education. We have to have an educated populace. And, you know, I've also heard the quote that all men are created equal, and I think we've evolved as a country, as a society, that we can say all people are created equal, and that is the equalizer that you have with public education, is we accept everybody that comes through that door. And it is my job to assure that every child that comes through that door regardless of their religion, their color of skin, their disability, their LGBTQ status, that they have a right to an education, okay? And speaking that public education, using Kathleen Nate's quote that this is a matter of national security, what do we do in public education? Well, obviously, we teach kids the fundamentals of reading and math, but I hope by the time they get to Chris's government class that they now have a foundation on how to think for themselves. That is not indoctrination. Teaching children to, thank you. Teaching children to think is really what we should be doing. And when we're being attacked and being accused of having kitty litter boxes in our bathrooms, and no, we do not have kitty litter boxes in our bathrooms. I couldn't hire a janitor to do that. Plus, it would be all over social media. But just the false narrative that has been not only presented to public educators, to librarians, to common sense minded legislators like Chanel Dixon, Senator Lent, and Representative Clow. Thank you for all you do, and thank you for fighting the good fight this last session. And so what I would like to see, and Chanel and I were interviewed yesterday, said, the reporter said, what would you like to see? And what I'd like to see is people getting involved and getting out to the polls and being educated and knowing, does your representative represent you? And this is what really concerns me right now, is we have people that are representing us in Idaho that are, I don't want to use the word strong arm, but they're influenced by outside forces, by outside think tanks. Many of them, their voting card, they may as well have given it to a couple organizations. And thank you, Senator Lent, thank you, Representative Clow and Chanel, for always trying to vote with what you think is in the best of Idaho. So thank you.
Thank you. And now we will jump into a couple of pre-submitted questions, and then we'll get to the cards. So the first question, during the hearing of this bill in the winter or spring, many legislators appeared kind of resigned to voting for the bill despite their own misgivings and a very large public response against it that I mentioned earlier. Luke, I'm going to give you this question. Can you explain the powers that are apparently tying the hands of our legislators and governor, and then follow up with what is the ultimate goal of those out-of-state organizations?
Okay, that's kind of a loaded question. Can you do the first part again?
So the first part is, can you explain the powers that are tying the hands of some of our legislators?
Well, I believe we saw this take place at a national level. And as House Bill 93 was working its way through, our president sent out a tweet which we estimate really swung some key swing votes the other way. And I would also believe that it probably tied our governor's hand when you get a tweet from your president that says, congratulations on passing a voucher bill, a tax credit bill. I mentioned this in my opening statement. The world for me has become wide open with AI. It's not A1, by the way, it's AI. And you can ask ChatGPT a number of things, and then you can go to Gemini and ask that AI a number of things, and now we have Copilot. And I always like to check my references. But I would just say, when you're bored and trying to go to sleep, is who's funding these people's elections that are for the vouchers, and where is this money coming from? And what we're seeing happen in Idaho is very similar. It's the same playbook that they used in Arizona. And if you follow what happened in Arizona, but there's a number of very wealthy think tanks or groups that are well funded at national level, and many of them have different reasons for why they're doing this. The rationale behind it, but unfortunately, there are some that would like to see public education fail. And not just public education, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about roads, people voted, my great-grandfather came here in 1904 and helped dig the canals in Twin Falls. And now we're voting away our water because these outside groups are telling us to do that. But anyway, back to, some of these groups, they're doing it for reasons that they want to privatize education. Think about it. There'd be money to be made in education if it became private. There are some for religious reasons that are wanting to do it, and then there are just some groups that are anti-government and want to see these things go by the wayside.
Thank you. Can you answer both parts?
Thank you.
All right, the second question, and we'll kind of divide this up, I think. Sponsors of Idaho's first voucher bill capped it at $50 million, but after it passed, one voucher advocate said $50 million will become $250 million in the blink of an eye. So Wonka, let me ask you this. Could this expansion from 50 to 250 happen in Idaho? And maybe talk about what that might look like.
This one's working. Hello?
Okay, yes, that expansion for the Idaho voucher program is very, very possible. So the House Bill 93 that was passed this February has a $50 million cap on it, but that bill also includes a provision that reevaluates the cap in 2026, potentially paving the way for future increases. We know that advocates for this school choice are already pushing for a more expansive program. House Bill 1, which was introduced early 2025, proposes a $250 million cap and up to $9,500 in tax credits per student. So we're seeing the growing momentum among the voucher proponents to expand this program. We see what's been happening in Arizona with their universal voucher program. In fiscal year 2024, their voucher program expanded to $738 million, and it's estimated to reach $864 million by the end of this fiscal year, which is straining their state budget immensely. In Idaho, of course, we have fears that if this were to happen without proper oversight for this program, it could escalate uncontrollably, and it could divert funds from our state's general fund, which funds our public education. And so while we see that this voucher program is currently capped, the inclusion of that reevaluation clause and the introduction of more expansive proposals indicate that future expansion is not only possible, but it's actively being pursued right now.
Okay, thank you. Chris, I'm going to give you part 2 of this question. How would that expansion affect our Idaho taxpayers and public schools?
Okay, so when applying something that's brand new to Idaho, as I'm sitting here researching it and trying to go through and understand the ramifications that we'll go through and have, all we can look to are the states that have already been passing a lot of these similar policies and these similar programs. So the poster child for the biggest stressors or the biggest problems is Arizona. It's, as the stats were already kind of given, a program that they had anticipated in their budget in 2022. They had said they only anticipated over the next 3 years rising up to maybe $125 million. But when they shifted the policy and removed the caps, they said, oh, now all of a sudden it's raising to $853 million. And how do we come up with that? That's almost what our school budget is. So we got to cut infrastructure problems. We can't build roads. We have to go through and cut funding projects for cities. We have to go through and cut other programs. So it blew out of control when they said, hey, we don't anticipate this getting that big. And then as soon as they say, well, we just do little tweaks and little changes to the plan to remove this cap or increase the amount just a little bit, and then pretty soon increase it more than double what they were allocating for their public school students. Pretty soon you had people asking for $16,000 cellos with taxpayer dollars. They were saying, well, we just did little tweaks and changes to this program, and now it's costing us hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars more. To go through and think about the idea of what would it look like here potentially for Idaho taxpayers. Thinking about it as simply as possible, many school districts in Idaho rely on levies to help supplement their budgets. And so where the discretionary fund was largely frozen for a lot of schools across the state because they renewed it at the previous level, which everybody knows inflation. I can't afford to feed my kids most days, so I work 3 jobs. So the whole idea is, hey, we got to go through and figure out how we deal with inflation in those things. But that's a whole nother town hall. But the thing is, we would have to go through and look at increasing these levies that many people so graciously already go through and pay to help support their education, because we believe in public education. But if you're saying, hey, you normally go through and have a levy that you pass every 2 years to go through and help supplement the budget for some of these shortfalls, imagine if the school's come back and saying, literally just to keep our numbers, and we've already had to do all these cuts in other programs, we have to ask for a levy that's more than double that. The example for that one would be Wisconsin. Wisconsin sat down, I believe it was 2024, when they said, we now are actually going to have to raise property taxes $577 million just to go through and come up with the shortfalls that are coming from this legislation. And when you look at some of those numbers, the $853 million that they were talking about in Arizona goes towards 8% of their students. So if you look at the numbers being applied, our taxes are going to have to go through and change drastically and put more of the bill on regular Idahoans. And I know that we'll talk about the other questions here in just a little bit, but a lot of that money, especially here for the Magic Valley, won't be here. So if you're looking at tax increases, levy increases, like requests and all that too, ultimately there's going to be a lot of unforeseen consequence, which is my biggest concern for the whole thing, is what are the ramifications going to be? We have to follow other schools in other states and watch what has happened, and don't let those mistakes happen here as well. So that's all we can do with something that is so new in my book.
Okay, thanks, Chris. And I would just throw in there that in every state where they have instituted some kind of voucher plan, it has been expanded. It has never stayed at the initial amount. I think is important. So, okay, we're going to move on to the third question. Supporters of this bill have messaged it as a win for school choice, while opponents have said it is a wealth distribution formula that provides a government subsidy with minimal accountability and zero transparency. So, Blanca, did Idaho have school choice before this bill, or is this the introduction of school choice in Idaho?
Well, we all know that Idaho already had school choice before this voucher bill was passed. We have charter schools, we have online schools, we have homeschooling. I'm out of Blaine County. We have multiple schools outside of the Blaine County School District. Supporters of this bill, like she said, do argue that it is supposedly going to open up more doors for parental choice when it comes to an education. And they contend that the program is a step forward towards more educational equity, especially for those families who may not be able to afford private tuition. But I, as an opponent, do not believe that. I do believe that it is a wealth redistribution that's going to divert public funds, because I already see it in Blaine County, where there are so many kids who are going to the local private school. And we know that private schools are not subject to the same regulations as public schools, and this bill did not meet what's his name? Brad Little. It did not meet his standards, his 4 standards for legislation, and he passed this voucher anyway. So I also think that this voucher program does not adequately serve low-income families like it boasts, because the funds are distributed on a first come, first served basis. And those are favoring the students and the families who are already financially able to afford public schools. And so they also highlight in some states with similar programs that private schools have raised their tuition fees to match the voucher amounts. Effectively, they're increasing costs without providing better education.
Okay, let's follow up. Luke, can you just talk about some of that accountability that private schools, do they have accountability for this money? Do you have any concerns about that?
So this is a difficult question for me, because I have an internal struggle because I used to be a private school administrator. In fact, I see one of my previous students out there, and I also see some private school teachers. Thank you. I know the sacrifice it takes to work at a private school and everything that goes into a private school. So when you speak about accountability, of course, as I put my superintendent hat on, and we have in public education, there's so many levels of accountability. And if we're going to be using state dollars for education, that part of me says that there needs to be accountability. And I know not all homeschool parents were in favor of tax credits. Some were, some weren't. And those that were not in favor is they do not want regulation by the government. And that is one of the freedoms of choice when you start private schools, specifically religious schools, is the separation of church and state. And going back to my days as a private school administrator, the last thing we want is the state to tell us what to do. To be transparent, I was a principal of a Catholic school here in Twin, and the number one thing that we did was we taught the Catholic identity. And another belief that I personally hold is that parents should be the number one educators of their children. And as a public school, as a private school, as a charter school, we're there to help the parent educate their child, because parents are the number one educators of their child. But right now, as the law sits, there's not going to be accountability. And as a taxpayer, if I'm giving my money to education, and that's the reason we have assessments, is to make sure that schools are teaching, teachers are teaching, and kids are learning. And if there's no accountability for that concerns me. And then also I have a strong conviction for the separation of church and state, and that this government should never get involved in religion and vice versa. And I just see those waters becoming very muddied with this. Also, it was mentioned, again, using Arizona as the poster child, that if there's no accountability, what are these kind of expenses going to be used on? I want to homeschool my child and teach them to be a barista, so I want a fancy cappuccino maker on my counter. True story. It happened in Arizona. So.
Okay, I'm going to weigh in on this for just a second. I want to read you a piece, just a portion of the Idaho Constitution, because I think that's important. So in Article 9, that's kind of the education section of our Constitution. Article 9, Section 1 says, the stability of a republican form of government, depending mainly upon the intelligence of the people, it shall be the duty of the legislature of Idaho to establish and maintain a general, uniform, and thorough system of public, free, common schools. So the Constitution's pretty clear where our money goes. And then if you bounce down to Section 5, it's talking about the religious education. It says, neither the legislature nor any county, city, town, township, school district, or other public corporation shall ever make any appropriation or pay from any public funds or monies whatever anything in aid of any church or sectarian or religious society, or for any sectarian or religious purpose, or to help support or sustain any school, academy, etc., controlled by any church, sectarian, or religious denomination whatsoever. So I'll just leave you with that, with our Constitution. And Chris, let's talk about some of the school choice options that people have through their public school. What are some of those options? And then the second part, I guess, to your question is how do you personally stay accountable to your students and their parents?
Okay. So I'm kind of a weird hodgepodge when it comes to this question, because I've got to see firsthand almost every single style of public education that exists. When I first started teaching, I had taught at a middle school that was a charter school. Taught there for a couple of years. Then I got to go through and teach at a middle school that is a public school here in Twin. I teach in Kimberly, but I also teach online. I've been teaching for iSucceed for 2 years, so that is another option that is available. And when we go through and see the availability of charters that go through and open up across our entire state, a few that have opened here recently, the variations that we go through and see are profound. And not only are they profound in what they're able to offer through the public school system, they have accountability that is the most important thing that is built in there. They have to go through and report how they're doing. They have to go through and follow the protections that are afforded for our wonderful little kids. they are the ones who have to go through and do this and don't see them as a monetization or a profit number or a bottom line. They see them as a kid. And they see them as somebody who is going to go through and make our state great. They're going to go through and be that contributor. They're going to be the person working on your car. They're going to be the person who's going to go through and fix your plow. They're going to be the person that's going to go out and have that expertise. And schools offer these through CTE programs, and they offer them through different job specialization opportunities, the workforce training programs that we do in cooperation with colleges. These things are great opportunities that are provided for kids, and they have the accountability measure. So I think that that's one that's really important. And you see it multifaceted, where I can go through and see kids in my classroom every single day as a public school teacher, but I also get to reach another community of kids teaching online. So, and they can do that depending on what their system is. But when you look at the options of creating private school funding, especially here in the Magic Valley, the options are extremely limited. And oftentimes those private schools are parochial. And so my youngest son goes to a private Christian school. But in no way, shape, or form would I ever want funding to go to a secular or a non-secular purpose on that one, because it infringes my safety as a Christian. The entanglement is the most dangerous way to get the government to control your faith. So you have to keep those things separate. In my book as a secularist, I guess. But the reality is we already offer so many different things. We were one of the states that was leading the whole country in school choice options through the public system. And we also have the wonderful homeschoolers to go through and take care of their kids that didn't want this funding because they say, I want the freedom to go through and teach my kids. We have magnet schools in our area that go through and have specific targeting demographics. We have alternative high schools. I just got to go through and be blessed to watch my nephew graduate from an alternative high school. If it hadn't been for the hard work at Magic Valley High, I don't know how that could have happened. Okay? So ultimately, when you go through and see those options, we already had multiple pathways. This doesn't seem to be something that was about trying to give more options for school choice. It was more about reallocating tax dollars to different purposes. So, and eventually exploding it. Because one of the things that we talk about for the funding, the ink is barely even dry on this bill. And the foundations that have already went through and pushed for it said, okay, 150 next year and keep pushing. It's like, what if Idahoans don't want it? What if they see the numbers as dangerous and they don't use it? You can't just say, we're going to push for it to be bigger and greater and bigger. What if Idahoans don't want it? You're not listening to Idahoans. So I think that's one of those big things we have to see and keep in mind is we have school choice. We have great school programs that push to go through and support our kids and their future here without having to say, let's just take more money and give it to other people without any accountability.
Can I add to that, Chair? As Chris was explaining all the options, one thing I'd like to add is some of the options at times can be a la carte. It doesn't have to be an all or nothing. We have many students that are also homeschooled and will come to us for a few classes or activities. We have, in our district, we have a charter school as well as a regular school that, and both of it in our district has authorized a charter school. So we will have families that might send one of their children or two of their children to charter school and then the others to the traditional school. So there, within the many options, there's additional options for individuals. And then as I think back to my time in private school, we did not have the capability to serve children with learning disabilities. And we leaned heavily on the public school that has a robust system for kids with special needs. And our district currently will serve private school students that need those extra services. And right now it's kind of unclear that do we have to provide those services if a parent chooses to take a tax credit? And I think that's up for probably law or they'll have to go to court to get that worked out. But I think it's going to get to the point where kids that are in private schools that are accepting tax credits, that the public school will be able to turn them away to have their needs met when it's for special education. And that's a concern.
Okay. Thank you. All right. We'll continue. We have a lot of questions. So this one was asked of you.
Of me?
So
They're giving so many better answers.
Well, this was specifically for you, and I just want to circle back to this. So you had mentioned the tweet from the president, perhaps strong-arming
Okay.
Governor Little. Could you explain that in terms of, if you recall, in Governor Little's State of the State, he did address $50 million for school, I think he called it school choice.
Yeah, he did, and Blanca did such a good job of explaining here where the criteria was to be met, and I think it could easily be argued that that criteria is not being met. And kind of going on to the theme of me, what I first introduced, this is what I keep going back to. We're Idahoans. We're proud of our independence. We're proud of being rural. Why are we being controlled by national? Why should the president be able to tell our governor what our schools are going to be like in Idaho? That should be our choice.
I'll let whoever wants to answer this. What about consistent standards as far as vouchers? Are there any requirements to have consistent standards across the board?
I can jump in a little bit on this one. So I'll try a little bit to answer on this one. I'm assuming the question means consistent standards across the states on how they've been applied.
No, educational standards.
Teaching standards.
Oh, so teaching standards, when they go through and they revamp those, I've actually been lucky to be able to sit on the social studies standards that they've revamped several times in that. One of the biggest pushes that we've had from the legislators that are pro-voucher and all that is that there are 0 standards required. They said we do not want to put any limits upon the private schools' ability to go through and teach our kids. So they would not be bound by any state standard that we have, which we have invested in. We have taken time to make sure that they uphold our Constitution, they uphold our conservative tendencies. There's a lot of time that goes into those standards, meeting for a lot of time. Representative Clow and I, we have been on those standards committees before, and there's so much that goes into them, and the big push for those receiving vouchers is 0 standards are required to be taught. Not only on that, but also on top of it, 0 testing requirements, 0 reporting of data, 0 accountability whatsoever. They said if you do that, you would really handcuff a private business's ability to run their business. So the hard issue that happens there is you have a double standard on the situation of saying, well, this is what's going to be best, and this is the best way to do it without any of that. But then schools have those very necessary accountability standards, because the 2 big things I always talk about that are really important in government are accountability and transparency. The ability for, if a person walks up and says, I want to see how you're doing, you can walk right in the door and we'll say, let's sit down, let's see how we're doing. And that's extremely important for accountability when it comes to our government. And this big push for the vouchers is 0 accountability. When the governor had talked about it, he said, I'd asked for 4 things and a price tag, and you guys were able to give me the price tag. And so the hard reality is right now, there are no standards that will be required by any of these, no testing requirements, no questions asked for the most part.
I'd like to go a little different direction with that. My experience with the vast majority of the private schools in the Twin Falls area, typically are religious schools. They do a great job academically. Most of their teachers are credentialed, and they often follow the standards. And my time at the private school I was at, we also took similar assessments that the public school did. But now we've opened the floodgates, and you're not going to be a private to receive a tax credit. There's not going to be accountability as far as certification. In Arizona, I think you have to give them what is a birth certificate or your high school. I don't even think it's high school diploma. No background check. Okay, and I think that's something that most private schools around here, I'm fairly certain that they do the background checks, that they have teachers that are credentialed. And so you will see these micro schools pop up with 30 or 40 students, basically in a garage or an empty building. And then when those schools close down, where do the kids go? The kids go back to the public school, but the funding's gone. And so now the public school is having to educate those children without the funding. But I just want to be very clear that again, my private school administrator's coming out here a little bit, but there are some private institutions that do a great job when it comes to academics. But I do worry about what will happen with there being no accountability.
Okay, this is a good follow-up question to that. As a hypothetical, what is to stop someone like Kanye West from starting his own private school and embezzling state funds?
I am not as learned in the bill perhaps as you, Chanel. But again, going back to, I don't believe there's a whole lot of accountability. The whole accountability of House Bill 93 is with the Tax Commission, correct?
Yes,
The Tax Commission, not the State Department of Education, the Tax Commission.
yes.
And so I don't think there's anything to stop somebody from using this money to start any kind of school they wanted to start.
Yeah, that is true. And I would also say that while we have some private schools that do a very good job, if someone like Kanye West wanted to come open up a private school, we have no standards that are required, none. And we have no accountability in this bill, we have no regulations in statute for private schools or homeschools. So hopefully that answers the question. There's nothing from stopping him.
I do want to go through and give the shout out to whoever said that question, because I bash on Kanye West all the time in my class. He's a musician that makes terrible music. But I mean, it's all right. He probably makes, well, sometimes he shuts the mic off. But the big thing is, when you think about this, currently anybody has that option to go through and open a school because of the lack of requirements to it. So you could see a celebrity opening a school like that to go through and say, I'm just going to teach music. And by the end of it, you didn't receive anything. I have no award to give you. You just were here for a while, and I cashed in on it for a while. They've seen in some of the other states examples where people opened what they called strip mall schools. They just found an open space.
Strip mall schools.
Yeah,
Not strip mall schools.
strip mall schools. Yeah. I think I said it right. And so, where they would go through and they would find, literally, one of the representatives in Arizona said, find any abandoned building you can. And they could open schools without requirements. The funding simply goes through the tax credit for the parent to say, if my kid's going there. The accountability model that is pushed is the idea that a parent would be informed enough to take a kid out of the school and say, well, hey, I realize my kid can't read and you haven't taught anything for a while. You show Disney movies all day long. But they would possibly not know that for a while because they got an A in everything. And if you are a business and your bottom line is based off of performance, wouldn't you make sure everybody had an A? And so the hard part of that situation is anybody can go through and open that without any requirements. I could go through and say, hey, I've found an old warehouse and I'm going to host 100 students. If I can get it, take the money and run. So it's a little concerning when it comes to that.
So you're saying it might hurt the integrity of our current private schools?
I would agree with that statement.
Yeah. I said that it might hurt the integrity of our current private schools.
Okay, we're going to shift gears just a little bit. There's several questions about special needs children and their accommodations in private schools. So can one or all of you kind of address that? What impact does House Bill 93 potentially have on our special needs children? What does that look like?
I am not an educator like these two wonderful gentlemen to my right. I am just a community citizen who is passionate about public education. I am a public education kid, and in Blaine County, more than 50% of our population is Latino. And so I took on this role as a board trustee to help advocate for their needs when they might not be heard. Because of that, this might not be public or special needs per se, but we have a big majority of students who are Hispanic who do not speak English, or who came into our school district maybe only even knowing how to speak Quechua, not necessarily Spanish. And so we have to have resources for those students so that they can, be brought up to speed. They might be just have a third grade education if they're in high school, and they need to be able to have the resources to be able to succeed within our school district that might be so different from what they're used to. We know that private education does not necessarily need to take on students that have special needs like that. So that is a big compelling issue for me, because we know all students have a right to public education regardless of where they came from, regardless of where they were born. And so a big proponent of this is that if you want to send your student to a private school and if they feel like they don't have the resources, yes, they can take your tax credit, but then they will push that student back into public education and let the public school teach that student the way he needs to be taught, because that's what public schools are here for.
Okay, I'll jump in on this one and I'll try to keep my emotions in check on this one. Whoever you are that answered that question, thank you. Okay. My wonderful wife and I got to go through and do one of the greatest passings that any parent gets to go through and see. We got to watch my daughter walk across the stage 2 weeks ago, graduating from high school. If it hadn't have been for the work of the special education department to help my daughter through autism, she might not have been able to walk across that stage. And when you see the requirements at some of these schools where they say we can go through and negate policies like IDEA or the ADA, we can sit down and say, sorry, your kid's just too expensive to educate. So we're not going to let your kid come here. So yeah, you're told you get choice. But we can choose to tell you you're too expensive for your kid to come here. I wouldn't have got to watch my daughter graduate. So the reality of them saying, hey, oh yeah, we'll accept kids that have special needs. That's not played out in other states. They are denied because they're too expensive to teach. And even in the states where you see them trying to pride the private schools on how they're accepting kids that have IEPs or special needs programs, the public schools have better results than those private schools. So the reality of saying, how is this going to impact special needs kids? It's going to have a detrimental effect on special needs kids. And they will be where they are cared and loved, and that's in public schools.
I don't know if it's happening in this part of the state, but in more urban areas of the state that have greater amount of private schools, the local public schools are being flooded with requests to have private school students assessed for a disability because there's $2,500 more for the tax credit. And that's a little concerning. And I touched on this before, but what's to stop now a public school if a student is a family is receiving a tax credit, being homeschooled, private school, when they come to our doors for special education, for driver's ed, to play on the sports team, to belong to FFA or any of those things, for us to say no now, because I think we can now, because this other school is being funded for that. So I worry about the collaboration that we have had with school choice previously. I think there's going to be a wedge between the traditional public schools and charter schools and the other option that the parents have had to educate their children.
Thanks. All right, there are a lot of questions on here about, and phrased in various ways, but people want to know if there are any legal challenges to House Bill 93 that you're aware of. And somebody mentioned, the fact that Utah's similar voucher bill was challenged in court and it was ruled unconstitutional.
Okay, I think it's working. I'd have to propose a hypothetical on that main theme that is on there, because oftentimes in order to go through and have, this is the government teacher in me coming out, in order for them to go through and have a case to try to sue about its constitutionality, you have to have somebody that has standing. So I'm assuming we probably have not had any cases brought against it yet about constitutionality because it is new. But you do see several states where you have people challenging these different programs, several states that are trying to figure out how to scale them back, several that are trying to figure out how to repeal them. And in this whole process, it's extremely difficult to repeal legislation once it's been passed. We could go through and see a new bill passed by our legislators to do that, or we can see a citizens repeal referendum called, where the people of Idaho could go through and say, hey, just because a small fringe of people that represent a tiny minority of Idahoans pass this bill doesn't mean the majority of Idahoans want it gone. So the reality is it takes a lot of work to get these out of the way, and I believe that because ours is so new, those things should be coming very quickly, and especially if you start to see a lot of the money funneled more directly into private parochial schools. Myself as a person who thinks the best way to protect faith is to keep government 100% out of it, should go through and say we have standing to say that you shouldn't be doing that, because the minute you start that small step into church and government, we go down a dangerous path. And so I'm hoping that as soon as it begins, people start considering those.
I believe it was last week or the week before, there was the Supreme Court case that ended in a 4-4 tie. One of the justices had to recuse themselves because her law firm had given it legal advice. But the situation was, and forgive me, I can't remember what states, I don't know what district court it's in, but there was a charter school that was wanting to become a Catholic charter school. And I find it very interesting that right now I think it'd be argued that we have a fairly conservative Supreme Court tied 4-4 on that, and which now has bumped that down to the ruling of the lower court. But that lower court is saying that you cannot use tax dollars or public dollars for religious schools.
Okay, and I think Chris answered, we had a stack of questions asking about how could we repeal this bill, and I think he addressed that. There could be a citizen referendum, or the legislature could repeal it. So, let's see. Okay, let's talk about why was House Bill 93 even a consideration when history shows in other states that it directly affects low-income and rural communities negatively.
I think we all want to talk. Go ahead.
I mean, okay, so I think about that, and I don't know why it would even be a consideration when we are seeing all of the negative outfall from other states. Why are we not learning from other states' mistakes? We know that there's big money in vouchers. There's a lot of big out-of-state money who are pro-vouchers and who are influencing our state legislature. And unfortunately, that is a lot louder than our own voices. And we saw that with all of the calls and all of the emails that were going to our governor's office, and he chose to ignore all of us and move forward with this bill. So I'm still flabbergasted at the fact that we're sitting up here talking about this bill having passed a couple of months ago, unfortunately.
Well, and one of those things that I think that Luke said earlier that was really good was the idea that you see this being played out in many other states, other conservative states as well. So oftentimes this idea is what's good for one is good for everyone. And so in a lot of those big groups that are like saying, hey, let's open our own chapters in each of the individual states and go through and force them to go through it too. You see that quite a bit happening here because they're saying, well, other states are doing that. They're having mixed results or terrible results. But we need to push it there anyways, because I would have to say why. I worry about, is it monetization? They see dollars to be made, because this isn't about school choice for kids. It's about money. And when you say, well, hey, the Idaho way is this, and this is how most people saw it, the overwhelming majority constantly saying we're against it, we're against it, we're against it. But small groups have funded these bills to pass and are already saying, make it bigger, make it bigger, make it bigger. And I, as a hard-headed Buell person, who am sitting here saying, you're going to tell me what's good for me. How about let me be educated, let me make a decision, listen to me. Because you're my representative. And I think that's one of those big things that's going to be really important, is we have to sit down and voice those concerns and say, this is what we want as people. Ask your people, your constituents, are us, not the people that are funding campaigns. And I apologize. I try not to go into politics on that one. But But at the end of the day, I think it's really important that we, as a collective in Idaho, say what is good for Idahoans. We have so many people that are moving to Idaho because of the Idaho way. So don't say the Idaho way is broken, you came here for it. So cherish it, enjoy it, love it. This is an impressive system that has made one of the greatest states that exists in our whole country. To change it and say what's happening everywhere else can be better for it, I think we're pretty solid as we are. Pretty proud to be an Idahoan, I guess.
So I may sound a little like a broken record, but personally, I found it to be offensive because the vast majority did not want vouchers, but it goes beyond vouchers. And again, I mentioned this. We have a number of legislators that pretty much have given their voting card to the Idaho Freedom Foundation. And they're more worried about what their score is going to be on the Idaho Freedom Foundation than anything else. And I find it very interesting that we can spend $50 million on tax credits, but when a bill was proposed to give $3 million that schools could apply for very high needs special education children, I apologize, I can't remember which chamber it passed, but then it was killed in the other chamber. Okay, and for a group of people that wants to point the finger and accuse us of indoctrination, there's a bill passed that and it's a very broad definition of what sex education is, but any sex education, it's broad enough to say if Chris is sexually harassing is a student sexually harassing another student, if I have to tell him that sexual harassment, is that sex education, okay? But it's just broad. But again, as a parent, I have no problem with that being an opt-in for students. So students have to opt in for sex education. But what I think is very hypocritical, then a law was turned around that mandates that our school has to show the video of the development of a human fetus, okay? So you tell me don't indoctrinate children, that you need to have parents opt in for sex education, but you must show this video. And I've asked the question, is showing the video and opt in? It's like, well, no, it's Idaho code. So I don't know. I mean, that's something that have to be worked out. But my point is I don't know if that this group thinks that we're savvy enough as Idahoans to know truly what we want as Idahoans.
All right, I would just add to those comments that in the last primary, $1.2 million was spent from just one or two out-of-state groups. And when you do a little research into what these groups want, they want school vouchers. So I think that's important to know. So as Idahoans and as voters, you need to be engaged because there are other forces at work. So let's look at, we're still trying to get through these. If a family homeschools or sends their kids to private school, let's say they have 4 children, does that mean they would get a $20,000 tax credit? And if their tax is less than $20,000, do they get that extra money back?
Did you do the homework?
I did. I did my homework. I'm happy that I looked that one up. But one of the hypotheticals that was actually proposed was if you had a specific family that was making this $20,000 credit. I believe that it was actually run on Idaho Ed News when they were talking about this article. They proposed a hypothetical student saying, hey, if they have 4 children making the $20,000, but they actually said if this hypothetical family made about $135,000, which is higher than the cap, but you can still apply for it. But if they were higher than the cap, but they had the $20,000, but they would only pay in an estimated, I believe it was $7,000 in state taxes, and it was like $12,000 in federal, somewhere around there. The amount of money they'd be receiving back in the vouchers would offset not only their state tax burden, but their federal tax burden. So they would be able to have all of their taxes fully refunded because they could offset by paying what they get from the voucher towards federal taxes to offset that. And then in this hypothetical family of 4 children, they were eligible with $135,000 as their income. They would still be taking home extra money after that. So the big thing is, and this is only a hypothetical for me to go through and propose, isn't that also wealth redistribution? Because now you're going through and saying even a person who's paying in their full amount, they don't have all the different ways and loopholes of hiding their taxes or saying their taxes are lower or whatever, they are still going to get back far more money than they ever put in. A common sense cap that would be included in here is saying you couldn't apply for any more than you pay in. Because at least then, if there was a cap put in place saying you cannot receive any more than you paid in state taxes, at least then it's going to cap when they say, well, it's my taxpayer dollars, shouldn't I get to choose where they go? It's an argument that you'll see. It's my taxpayer dollars, shouldn't I choose where they go? But if it's way more than your taxpayer dollars, they're my taxpayer dollars, and shouldn't I choose where they go? And so it's an interesting conundrum that will occur when you go through and see those scenarios. So yes, from what we've seen from all the hypotheticals that they've proposed and they've talked to at the State Department of Education with the tax offices, they say we can only estimate, but there are no restrictions on that. So it is definitely going to happen.
I would like to add to that. I was watching a hearing where a senator in Texas was talking to the governor. I don't know if you guys know, but Elon Musk lives in Texas. He is now a Texas resident. He has a compound. He has 14 children. So the senator was asking the governor, if Elon Musk puts all of his children into public or private education, 14 children times 12 years, he would be eligible for $1.2 million worth of taxpayer money for his children to go to private school. And is that fair? The governor said, as a Texas resident, he is entitled to that money. And so that is another big issue that we see is that, yes, there are income limits to this voucher bill, but what I have seen is that in Blaine County, it costs about $20,000 a year for a child to go to the community school. You have to pay that up front. So as a tax credit, you have to be able to have the money up front and then get reimbursed afterwards. So how many low-income families are going to be able to put their children into private education to then be able to wait on that tax money to come back to refund them? So if that money is going to be standing by, when it's not depleted, then families who make more than the 300% of the poverty line will be able to apply for that money because it will be available because those low-income families are not taking it.
Okay, there are a couple of questions here, and if you don't know, I can answer this, but could any of you address how much or what percent of our property taxes or even an average dollar amount go to our public schools, and the same with our Idaho state income tax? And I'm happy to jump in, actually.
I missed that homework assignment.
Well, I did a little research about it.
So property tax would depend on the levy rate of the local school district. And so if the local school district has a plant facility levy or a supplemental levy or a bond levy, it would depend. It's a formula, but it depends on the market value in the entire district, and then how much. And there's limits. There's statutory limits of how much you can levy and bond for, and it's right around 5% of your total market value before the homeowner's tax exemption. So property taxes used to fund the general operation of schools, but that was done away with in 2008, 6, somewhere in there. And right now it'd be local property taxes that were passed by the patrons that fund the school. And I'm not sure on the income tax on that percentage.
So I did a little research for the Twin Falls School District, and your average home in Twin Falls pays about $500 a year towards the Twin Falls School District. And then on income taxes, and I don't know what percentage of our income taxes go to schools right off the top of my head, but the average Idahoan pays about $3,000 a year in state income taxes. So when you start doing the math, you know, that earlier question of 4 children in a family and they're getting 20 grand back, your average family has not paid nearly that much into their school. So, okay, I think we have touched on most of the questions, even though I still have a big stack here. So we're going to have a few closing remarks. We'll give each of you about 3 minutes, just because we're nearing the end of our time together. So 3 minutes to wrap up, and if you can, please focus on how our attendees can continue these conversations and what action they can take when they leave tonight. Should we start with you?
Sure. We have heard a lot of compelling information tonight, and we all know where Idaho currently stands when it comes to school vouchers. But we need to make sure that we let our elected officials know where we stand. And we are their constituents. They are here to represent us. So what I ask of you is to call and email your local legislators, your senators, rally your friends and your family, educate them. I have a sister who has her kids in a charter school, and I thought that my sister was a little bit more in the know, but apparently she had no idea what House Bill 93 was. So once I talked to her, she was riled up about this. You know, a lot of people don't realize what it is that's happening. So we need to educate our friends, we need to educate our family on what House Bill 93 really is, about how this expansion can affect us negatively in the state of Idaho. It affects our state budget, it affects our public school students. So we need to make sure that we stay engaged, that we talk about this, don't let it fall to the wayside. There's so many things that are coming at us right now, you know, locally, statewide, federally, so many different things that are diverting our attention, but we need to make sure that we stay focused on this. So we know that we are small, but we are mighty, and we can make change.
All right. Definitely great ideas on that one, Blanca. The big thing that I go through and think is remembering what we're going through and fighting for. We're fresh off that season of graduations happening every single night, and having to send off 1 million cards for all those family members, nieces, nephews, grandchildren, everybody going through and saying, oh, here's another chunk of my paycheck, but I love you. But the thing is, these graduations are the culmination of community efforts. When you go through and you see what's put into all of these different school functions, when you see what goes into community events hosted by schools and all that stuff, it's not just the kids, it's not the teachers, it's not the administrators, it's the community. And these are community entities. They're not just factories for going through and cranking out cogs to work in the corporate machine. We're out here investing in our future, which is kids. And that's where public education shines the best, is we are here to do what our communities want us to go through and do. So being active in calling for your legislators who will go through and say, well, listen to the constituents, say, this is what's important to us. These values are very important to us. So reaching out to them, contacting them, making the phone calls, sending the emails, and getting your family members involved in voting in primaries and in the general election, making sure that people are willing to come out, because you don't want to have Idaho represented by a very small minority. The majority of Idahoans have the same core values, and that's loving your family, raising good kids, being constructive citizens, and trying to go through and keep Idaho the best state that exists in our entire union. So the reality is we need to go through and keep those at the forefront of our minds and remind our legislators that the Idaho way is the way that has made us awesome.
I truly don't know if I can top Blanca or Chris. I would begin with thanks for coming out and being involved. It's nice to see a full room because I think too often we've been quiet. And somebody told me once, and it's always stuck in my head, is as long as good people remain quiet, evil will persist in our world. And we need to start standing up to truly what we want Idaho to look like. Now, we've spoken specifically to vouchers and tax credits tonight. But this group that has infiltrated our legislature is not going to stop there. And I would say go out and educate yourself, listen to podcasts, read books, read their playbook. It's scary, and educate yourself and talk to these things with your neighbors, like Chris said, because what we're finding out, people don't get involved until it impacts them. You know, maybe I'm an empty nester now, and I don't have kids or grandkids to go to the school, so what does that matter to me? You know, it does matter to you. You know, when I was in high school, I either wanted to be a dairy farmer or a teacher, and my uncle pulled me to the side and said, you know, you don't like to get up very early, so I think you need to become a teacher. Actually, he said, we don't have room for you. But anyway, I'm very concerned about what's going on with our water, and our water being voted away by our contingency legislators here. That's very concerning to me, and it should be concerning to you as well. So, as these two have said, get involved, pay attention to what's going on. You know, we all have these phones in our hands. You know, sign up for the emails from like the Idaho Press and I Am Boise and those different things, so you truly know what's going on. I mean, you can be you can be here in Twin Falls, but you can know what's going on every day in the state legislature by looking at their agendas. Reach out to your legislators. I mean, Lance has always been willing to sit down and visit with me. Doesn't always like to hear what I have to say, but Lance is a great listener, and I know that there are many that are. So thanks again for coming out. Chanel, thank you for doing this.
Thank our panelists, and I thank each of you for coming out tonight. As we've talked about tonight, the conversations that we have that lead up to the next legislative session can determine whether this program is expanded or not. And so one way that you can share your opposition is to sign the Not a Dollar More petition, and you'll see the QR code up there, and I believe the petition is also out in the lobby. So you can sign that. This petition is, the goal is to get 1,000 signatures in each legislative district. And then make it clear, we'll pass those on to our lawmakers and make it clear that Idahoans do not want to see the $50 million program expanded. So we'd encourage you to do that and sign up to stay informed. I think I have one more slide for you. Yep, you can use this QR code to volunteer. We can use lots of help over the next few months. And again, thank you for coming. We appreciate your attendance and your involvement. So have a good rest of your evening.
I was like,